If you think this war is about Iran versus Israel, you've been watching the wrong map. That's not a criticism of you. It's a criticism of how this story has been covered. Cable news gives you missile counts and building damage. It gives you Tehran versus Tel Aviv, good guy versus bad guy, a clean binary you can process in a 30-second segment. What it doesn't give you is the actual mechanism, the part of this conflict that determines whether it stays a two-country war or becomes something that pulls in 32 nations, including your own government, whether your parliament or Congress ever votes on it or not. Here's the anchor fact, and I want you to sit with it for a second. On March 2, 2026, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stood in Brussels and said something very specific. He praised the US-Israeli campaign against Iran, and in the same breath, he said the alliance itself would not be involved. Why would the head of NATO feel the need to say that, unprompted, on camera? You don't issue a denial for a scenario nobody's worried about. By the end of this video, you'll understand the actual structural risk sitting underneath this war, not the missiles, the mechanism. I'm going to give you a named framework for how a two-country war becomes a treaty-triggering event. I'm going to show you the exact incident in March of this year where that mechanism nearly fired. And I'm going to leave you with 3 specific falsifiable predictions and the exact signals to watch, so you don't have to trust me. You can check my work in real time. Let's get into it. Quick disclaimer before we start. Everything in this video is built from publicly available reporting, CENTCOM statements, NATO press briefings, on-record quotes from named officials. I'll show you the sources as we go. I could be wrong about the analysis, and I want you to check the sourcing yourself and push back in the comments if you see it differently. This is analysis, not prophecy. Here's the concept you need for the rest of this video. I call it the chain gang trigger, a deliberately engineered or opportunistically exploited border incident that activates an alliance's mutual defense obligation without any single member state having chosen the war in the first place. The term borrows from a real concept in international relations theory called chain ganging, where allies get dragged into a conflict not because they wanted it, but because the alliance structure itself leaves them no room to say no once a triggering event occurs. I'll come back to the theory later. For now, just hold the plain language version. A chain gang trigger is the moment a regional war stops being regional because someone else's treaty obligation just got activated. Keep that term in your head. Everything else in this video builds on it. Let's build this from the ground up, fact by fact. Fact 1. This war has a start date, and it starts with a decapitation strike. Operation Epic Fury, the U.S. codename for joint military operations with Israel against Iran, began on February 28, 2026, and ran through May 5th. The opening strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with members of his family. This is documented by Britannica's running timeline of the conflict and corroborated across major outlets. Strategically, this matters because it's not a proportional response to a single provocation. It's a leadership decapitation strike, the kind of opening move that removes any chance of managed de-escalation on the other side, because there's no longer a clear chain of command in Tehran to negotiate with. Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, reportedly wounded in the same strike that killed his father, mother, and other relatives, remained out of public view for months afterward. CNN reported in July that his continued absence had fueled open questions inside Iran about who was actually running the country. I'll flag that as reported, not confirmed. Succession inside a wartime regime is exactly the kind of thing that gets rumored and exaggerated. Fact 2. A ceasefire-adjacent framework exists, and Iran has been testing its edges. A memorandum of understanding reached in June 2026 sought to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and wind the war down. According to Britannica's timeline, Iran instead tried to assert control over the strait, warning commercial vessels to use approved routes, and on July 6th and 7th, firing on 3 commercial ships. The U.S. responded with strikes on more than 80 targets inside Iran and reimposed oil sanctions, according to CNN's live coverage from July 7th. Strategically, this tells you the MOU didn't end the war, it just changed its shape. Iran, degraded militarily, is using the Strait, a choke point roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil passes through, as its remaining point of leverage. That's a rational move for a weakened actor. It's also exactly the kind of move that keeps inviting the next US strike. Fact 3. The NATO summit in Ankara became a second front, not against Iran, but between Israel and Turkey. At the NATO Leaders Summit in Ankara in early July 2026, President Trump signaled support for lifting the block on selling F-35 stealth fighters to Turkey. Netanyahu, in an on-record Fox News interview reported by the Times of Israel, argued Turkey shouldn't get F-35s or engines for its own fighter program. Turkey's foreign ministry publicly accused Israeli officials of running a coordinated disinformation campaign, according to Arab news reporting from July 7th. This is the first time Israel has publicly opposed a U.S. arms sale to a fellow NATO member. That's according to Forbes defense reporting from mid-July. And it's worth sitting with, because it hasn't happened before, not even during decades of Turkish-Israeli friction. Strategically, this is the seam in the story most coverage misses. Israel isn't just fighting Iran. It is now in an open lobbying war against a NATO member state, inside a NATO institution, at the exact moment that NATO member shares hundreds of miles of border with the country Israel is bombing. Fact 4. Turkey has already used NATO's collective air defense apparatus against an Iranian missile. This is the fact that should anchor the entire video for you. In early March 2026, Turkey's defense ministry accused Iran of firing a ballistic missile toward Turkish airspace. Turkey used NATO air and missile defense assets to intercept it. Foreign Policy magazine reported this on March 4, 2026, along with an on-record statement from a NATO spokesperson, Alison Hart, saying the alliance stands firmly with all allies, including Turkey. A short quote, but a deliberate one, issued the same week. Strategically, I want to be very precise here about what did and didn't happen. NATO's Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, was not invoked. Turkey did not request a formal Article 5 consultation, as far as public reporting shows. But the alliance's infrastructure was already engaged defensively on Turkish soil against an Iranian-origin missile months before this video was made. That is the tripwire sitting in plain sight. It didn't fully trigger. It got very close to the on-ramp. Fact 5. Rutte's public denial, 5 days later, wasn't accidental. On March 2, 2026, right around this same window, Rutte told German broadcaster ARD that NATO backed what the US and Israel were doing to degrade Iran's nuclear and missile capability, but explicitly said the alliance itself would not be involved. I want to flag something here about sourcing. A separate Al Jazeera piece from March 23 quotes a former U.S. Navy officer, Harlan Ullman, describing the odds of NATO formally joining the war as between slim and none. That's an analyst's opinion, not a fact. I'm citing it as a credentialed view, not as established reality. Strategically, when the head of an alliance goes out of his way, unprompted, to draw a bright line around involvement, that's not a neutral statement. That's crisis management. You manage a risk that's live, not a risk that's theoretical. Fact 6. The escalation ladder toward Turkey and other frontier states hasn't stopped. By late July, the pattern kept recurring in different forms. On July 22nd, an Iranian missile attack struck near Eilat, and the same day the UK withdrew its diplomatic staff from Iran, citing an ongoing security situation reported by the Times of Israel's live coverage. On July 26th, Iran's foreign minister publicly claimed Ukraine had attacked an Iranian vessel at Israel's behest and promised a response, a claim I'm flagging explicitly as alleged and currently unverified by independent reporting. And as of July 28th, Trump and Netanyahu met for the first time since the war began, according to Britannica's live timeline, with a prior U.S.-Iran pause in attacks reported on July 26th holding for now. Strategically, notice the direction of travel. The war keeps generating secondary flashpoints. Jordan, Eilat, a claimed Ukrainian vessel incident. Each one a new potential node where a non-belligerent state gets pulled toward direct involvement. None of them have triggered a formal alliance response yet, but the rate at which new nodes are appearing is the thing worth tracking, not any single incident in isolation. Now let's steelman the opposing view, because it's a genuinely strong one, and you'll hear it from serious people.
The steelman.
NATO will never get formally dragged into this war. The alliance's own Secretary General went on camera and said so directly. A credentialed former U.S. Navy officer put the odds at slim to none. NATO's actual summit outcome in Ankara, according to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs interview with their own security expert who was present in Ankara, was an ironclad commitment to collective defense generally, alongside language calling on Iran to respect free navigation through Hormuz, not a war footing against Iran specifically. Turkey, for all its friction with Israel over the F-35 sale, has not once requested a formal Article 5 consultation over Iranian missile activity near its border. Erdogan runs a transactional foreign policy. He buys Russian S-400s, he talks to Trump about burden sharing, he plays every side. A leader like that has every incentive to avoid a war, not invite one. On paper, this looks like a contained US-Israel-Iran conflict that the rest of the alliance is carefully, deliberately staying out of. What's true in that? All of it, actually. Rutte's statement is real and on record. Article 5 has genuinely not been invoked. Turkey has behaved cautiously in the sense that it hasn't escalated its March missile intercept into a formal alliance request. This isn't a fringe view, it's the mainstream, sober read, and most professional Iran watchers would tell you the same thing. Here's what it can't explain, though. Rebuttal 1. If the chain gang risk were purely theoretical, NATO wouldn't have needed live air defense assets deployed against an actual Iranian-origin missile over Turkish territory in March. That's not a hypothetical scenario analysts are wargaming. It already happened, once, this year. The steelman treats the current calm as evidence there's no wire to trip. It's better read as evidence the wire got tripped once already and didn't go off, which is a different thing entirely. Rebuttal 2. The Israel-Turkey rupture over the F-35 sale isn't a side story. It actively degrades the alliance's ability to manage a future incident cleanly. When Israel is publicly accusing a NATO member of harboring an extreme movement that hates America, and that NATO member is publicly accusing Israeli officials of running a coordinated disinformation campaign, that's according to on-record statements from both governments reported by Times of Israel and Arab News in July, you have degraded trust between two of the actors most likely to be in the room together if a real Article 5 moment arrives. A calm alliance handles a border incident through quiet channels. An alliance where two key players are trading public accusations doesn't have that luxury. Rebuttal 3. The escalation nodes are multiplying, not stabilizing. Jordan, a diplomatic evacuation from Iran, an unverified Iranian claim about Ukraine acting, quote, at Israel's behest. That's 4 distinct new flashpoints in the second half of July alone, on top of the March Turkey incident. The steelman's confidence rests on Article 5 not having fired yet, but it doesn't account for the fact that the number of tripwires available to fire has been increasing, not decreasing, even as the formal war between the US, Israel, and Iran shows signs of a fragile pause. The concept I mentioned earlier, chain ganging, comes out of alliance theory in international relations, most associated with the scholars Thomas Christensen and Jack Snyder. The core idea: in a tightly bound alliance system, member states sometimes go to war not because they calculated it was in their interest, but because the alliance structure removed their ability to opt out once a triggering event occurred. Nobody has to want the war. The mechanism does the choosing. The classic real-world case is the July crisis of 1914, a regional assassination in Sarajevo that, moving through a web of overlapping alliance commitments, pulled in great powers within about 5 weeks, most of whom had no direct stake in the original dispute. I'm not saying 2026 is 1914. The parallels are structural, not literal, and NATO's Article 5 process, unlike the secret treaties of 1914, requires deliberate consultation rather than automatic activation. But the underlying psychology is the same. The danger was never any single actor's stated intention. It was the machinery connecting them. Here are 3 specific, falsifiable predictions. Write these down and come back to check them. Prediction 1. Within the next 60 days, there will be at least one additional documented incident of Iranian-origin missile or drone activity crossing into or being intercepted over Turkish territory or airspace. Signal to watch. A statement from Turkey's Ministry of National Defense or a NATO press release referencing Turkish air defense activity. Prediction 2. Israel's public campaign against the Turkish F-35 sale will not succeed in blocking it outright, but will delay a final delivery timeline past what Trump signaled in Ankara. Signal to watch. Any formal congressional notification of an F-35 sale to Turkey or its absence over the next 2 to 3 months. That notification is a required, trackable step in any U.S. arms sale of this scale. Prediction 3. NATO's public position will continue to be supportive but uninvolved. But expect at least one more on-record statement from Rutte or a NATO spokesperson explicitly reaffirming that the alliance will not intervene militarily, issued in direct response to a specific incident, not as a routine briefing line. Signal to watch. The timing. If that statement follows within 48 hours of a new incident, it tells you the alliance is managing a live concern, not a hypothetical one. That's the same pattern we saw around the March Turkey incident. Homework. 3 sources to go read yourself. 1. Britannica's continuously updated 2026 Iran war timeline page. It's sourced, dated, and the single best chronological reference for everything covered in this video. 2. NATO's own summit communique from the Ankara meeting in July 2026, available on nato.in. Read the actual collective defense language yourself, rather than taking any analyst's paraphrase of it, mine included. 3. And this one needs no reading at all, just watch a number. The price of Brent crude oil and Hormuz-specific shipping insurance war risk premiums, both publicly tracked and updated daily. When either one spikes sharply without a new US or Israeli strike as the obvious trigger, that's usually the market pricing in exactly the kind of secondary escalation risk we've been discussing tonight, before it's confirmed in the headlines. So here's what I'll leave you with, and I'm not going to answer it for you. NATO's entire public posture rests on one clean distinction. Supporting an ally's war is not the same as fighting it. That distinction held in March. It's holding right now. The question is what happens the first time it doesn't, and whether anyone will have chosen that outcome, or whether it will simply have happened to them.